All right, Congressman Rick Crawford, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it. I want to talk about what's going on. Lots of things happening at the Capitol right now. Let's begin with a proposal that was rolled out by Speaker Paul Ryan earlier this week about an alternative to Obamacare. It keeps a couple of the things that are already in the current Affordable Care Act, such as not denying insurance for those with pre-existing conditions. But one of the things that it does change is instead of subsidizing some low-income citizens with health insurance, it provides them a tax credit. Why is that better public policy? Because there's no guarantee that that tax credit is going to be spent on health insurance.
Well, I think that there are actually some forms that you have to fill out, and that it would be required that that's what it goes for. So there's some accountability measures in place to make sure that that tax credit does in fact go for what it's supposed to.
There's an option for block grants for Medicaid to come back to the states instead of the program having some federal structure to it now. Do you support that change, and why do you support that if you do?
Well, I think there are different geographies and different prerogatives within states, and state to state I think they're in a position to be able to administer those programs that best suit the state rather than a one-size-fits-all template from the federal government. So I think that states that are doing things right and want to have a little more autonomy are being respected in that regard. So I think that it does provide a little more flexibility state to state.
Another big debate on Capitol Hill. It's been on the Senate side, but there's certainly the possibility it's going to bleed over into the House side, and that is over gun control. Certainly in the wake of the Orlando shootings, we've had a lot of conversation about that. 4 gun law measures stalled over in the U.S. Senate earlier this week. Basically, the gist of them was to keep people who are on the terrorism no-fly list from being able to get a gun. Why is it so difficult for as simple of a measure as that to find its way into law?
That's a good question, and I didn't read the bill, so I'm really not the person to comment on it in terms of whether or not it should have passed or whether it shouldn't have, and without having laid eyes on it, I probably couldn't comment specifically on that bill, on those 4 bills.
Well, do you support, in theory, though, the ability to stop someone from getting a gun who might be on the no-fly terrorism list?
Well, that depends. I mean, you can end up on a no-fly list and you can end up on a terror watch list. You certainly got to make a distinction between the two, and you also have to make sure that you're respecting the due process of American citizens in the process of placing them on a no-fly list or potentially a terror watch list, and making sure that they do have due process consideration and potentially getting off of it. But I do think that we certainly need to be supporting law enforcement in their efforts to glean intelligence that might protect us and prevent another incident like what happened in Orlando.
So in theory, though, you support the prospect of that as long as there is some due process or some sort of recourse for someone to appeal and have the option, so that it's not just a government makes the decision and that's it sort of concept.
Well, I think that you're abridging someone's constitutional rights if you put them on a no-fly list and then it's their responsibility to get off of it. I think you rob them of their due process, and I don't think that we rob people of due process on other constitutional rights, say for example free speech. I think that's something that you shouldn't abridge someone's free speech and then make it their responsibility to earn that right back. I think that there has to be a due process consideration in all constitutional regards.
Let's talk catfish. I know you like to talk about catfish, and there's plenty to talk about, which may not be on some people's radar, but imported Vietnamese catfish has been found to contain chemicals and some carcinogens. There have been some recalls. According to some of the press reports that I have read, the USDA is now looking over and inspecting this imported catfish and finding a lot of problems with it that the FDA wasn't. What are the politics behind this effort to shift inspections to USDA from FDA? Can you kind of explain what's in the works here?
Well, it's a good question. I think what we're talking about is one example of where we got the policy right, and the agency that is now in charge of inspecting catfish is actually doing it right. And we see the evidence of that This rule was published and went into effect in mid-April, and within about 2 to 3 weeks, they had already intercepted at least 2 Vietnamese shipments, and then 2 other shipments from China turned around and went back. And then we found out that I think it was late last week that there was a level 1 recall of a contaminated shipment that went out to various locations around the country. And it's an example of an agency that actually is engaged in doing their job right, as opposed to the previous inspection process, which allowed about 98% of the catfish that entered this country to enter our food chain uninspected. So, the motivation for why you'd want to undo that, I'm not sure. I mean, there's an old GAO report that projected that the cost of the USDA inspection process would cost about $14 million a year. That was way overstated. In fact, since the rule was published and since it went into implementation, we see those costs are down around $1.1 million per year. Yes, it costs more than the FDA. It costs about $350,000 more per year. However, they operate at about 98% greater efficiency than the FDA. And so when you talk about the value to the taxpayer, it's certainly a much greater return on that investment from the taxpayer's perspective in light of food safety.
And you're working to keep the USDA as the inspection agency on that. We have a divided food safety inspection process in this country between those agencies. Should we put this all under one umbrella? What could be done in that respect?
Well, I think we should. I mean, I think that you see that Food Safety and Inspection Service under the USDA umbrella is doing it right. And they have, in my opinion, they've shown that this is an agency that has food safety as their primary mission, and they're doing it right. This is in line with other imported meats like beef, chicken, poultry. Anything that's imported into the country should be subject to the same safety requirements and restrictions that domestic commodities are. And so that's basically what this is. I don't have a problem with foreign products entering the country, but what I do have a problem with is unsafe foreign products entering the country and becoming part of our food source. And so what we've seen here is we have a policy in place now, and the practical application of that policy indicates that it's working. And why would we want to undo that and subject our consumers to undue risk of carcinogens? And look, the American Cancer Society supports our effort to retain the USDA inspection process. It's that important. We're not talking about an immediate outbreak of listeria or salmonella or some other foodborne illness that you see oftentimes even in our domestic food supply. We're talking about a long-term exposure to the kind of carcinogens that lead to cancer and other diseases that can be stopped. And it's working, and we don't want to go back and further expose our U.S. consumers to foodborne contaminants.
All right, I can't have you on without asking you a question about the GOP presidential nominee in the presidential race. It seems to dominate our headline.
You can do that.
I cannot. Donald Trump, your party's presumptive nominee. I think you are on the record as supporting Donald Trump. Is your support for Donald Trump an enthusiastic support for Donald Trump, or is it a I'm against Hillary Clinton vote?
Well, I represent the 1st District of Arkansas, and Donald Trump won the 1st District of Arkansas, in fact won the entire state. I think there were very few counties that he did not win in pretty resounding fashion. And so I really think that it's important that I reflect the wishes of my constituents and support our nominee. And so that's where I am with this.
Well, he won 58 of 75 counties in the Republican primary. Hillary Clinton won 74 of 75 counties in the Democratic primary. So explain to me how you're justifying Donald Trump. Is it just a party affiliation thing?
Well, sure. I'm a Republican.
Fair enough. All right. There's also been some talk about a potential delegate revolt in Cleveland at the convention. Are those just rumors and wishful thinking from some folks of the NeverTrump movement? Do you actually see some momentum that might happen? And what is your take on whether or not there should be a delegate revolt?
Yeah, I think that's just some talk, and it kind of keeps the conversation alive. But ultimately, I don't think that's going anywhere. And look, Donald Trump, whether you like him or not, he garnered more primary votes, I think, than any Republican presidential nominee in history. And so I really think these efforts are going to fall flat. As you know, and we had this conversation before, I was a Rubio guy, my guy didn't win, but that's the nature of the game, and you suit up and you go on the field and you play your position for your team, so that's what I'm doing.
All right, Representative Rick Crawford, always good to visit with you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.